The history of warfare is often dominated by giants. We imagine our great commanders as physical titans, men of iron constitution like Charlemagne or the Duke of Wellington, figures who seem carved from the same granite as their monuments. But the greatest naval commander in British history, perhaps the greatest in human history, was none of these things. If you were to stand on the quarterdeck of the HMS Victory in the autumn of 1805, looking for the god of war who held the fate of Europe in his hands, you might have missed him entirely. Horatio Nelson was a physical wreck. He stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall. He was perpetually seasick, a condition that plagued him from his first days as a midshipman to his final hours as a vice admiral. By the height of his power, his body was a map of his violent life. His right eye was blinded, clouded over from debris at the siege of Calvi. His right sleeve was pinned empty to his coat, the arm having been sawed off in a dark tent at Tenerife. He suffered from malaria, recurring fevers, and what we would today likely diagnose as chronic depression. He was vain, melodramatic, and desperate for affection. Yet, this fragile, broken man possessed a terrifying genius for violence that the world had never seen before and has rarely seen since. To understand Nelson, we must first discard the polished image of the column in Trafalgar Square and look at the man who terrified the French Navy into paralysis. His genius lay in a simple, brutal paradox. While the naval doctrine of the 18th century was built on order, geometry, and self-preservation, Nelson's philosophy was built on chaos and annihilation. He did not want to defeat the enemy, he wanted to erase them. This drive did not come from a position of strength, but from a lifetime of overcoming weakness. Born in 1758 in a Norfolk parsonage, Nelson was one of 11 children. His mother died when he was 9, a loss that biographers often cite as the root of his lifelong aching need for external validation and love. He was not pushed into the Navy by a stern father, he begged to go. At 12 years old, he joined his uncle's ship, the Raisonnable. It was a harsh entry. The Royal Navy of the 1770s was a wooden world of strict hierarchy, brutal discipline, and unrelenting physical labor. For a slight, sickly boy, it should have been a death sentence. Instead, it became his crucible. Nelson's early career was defined not by battles, but by survival. He was sent to the East Indies, where the heat and disease broke stronger men. He contracted malaria, which left him partially paralyzed for a time and permanently weakened his constitution. He spent time in the Arctic, nearly getting killed by a polar bear in a foolish attempt to get a skin for his father. These years were not glorious. They were a grind of navigation, seamanship, and endurance. But they taught him something that the aristocratic admirals of the fleet often forgot: the reality of the ship as a living organism. He learned every rope, every current, and every limitation of the wooden vessels he sailed. Because he was physically unable to dominate men through force, he learned to dominate them through charisma and competence. He discovered that if he could not be the strongest man on the ship, he would be the most professionally capable. This obsession with seamanship became the foundation of his tactical brilliance. He knew exactly what a ship could do, how close it could sail to a shoal, and how fast it could turn. This technical mastery allowed him to take risks that appeared suicidal to others, but were calculated certainties to him. By the time the French Revolutionary Wars broke out in the 1790s, Nelson was a captain who had already stared death in the face a dozen times. Not from grape shot, but from yellow fever and mosquitoes. He had developed a fatalistic view of his own life. He believed he was destined for something great or a quick end, and he seemed indifferent to which one it was. This fatalism was his superpower. In an era where admirals were court-martialed for losing ships, Nelson operated with a total disregard for safety. He realized that the greatest risk in war was not action, but inaction. As he rose to command, the British Empire was facing an existential threat. Revolutionary France was overturning the old order of Europe. They possessed a fervor and a mass mobilization that the conservative monarchies could not match on land. But at sea, the equation was different. The sea required skill, not just fervour. It required a commander who could harness the technical superiority of the Royal Navy and unleash it with the revolutionary energy of the French themselves. England needed a man who was willing to break the rules. They found him in the sickly, one-eyed captain from Norfolk, who was about to turn the Mediterranean into his personal hunting ground. To fully grasp the magnitude of Nelson's genius, we must first understand the rigid world he sought to dismantle. By the late 18th century, naval warfare had devolved into a stately, almost mathematical stalemate known as the line of battle. Admirals were bound by the permanent instructions, a set of dogmatic rules issued by the Admiralty. These rules dictated that a fleet must stay in a single, unbroken line, sailing parallel to the enemy. The two fleets would exchange broadsides, thousands of pounds of iron, until one side was battered enough to withdraw. It was safe, it was controllable, and it was deeply ineffective. Battles were indecisive, ships were rarely captured, and enemy fleets were almost never destroyed. They simply lived to fight another day. Nelson viewed this caution with contempt. He understood a fundamental truth that his contemporaries missed. The British Royal Navy possessed a singular advantage that the line of battle wasted. British gun crews were the best in the world. Through relentless drill, a British crew could fire 3 broadsides for every 2 fired by the French or Spanish. In a polite, long-range duel, this advantage was marginalized. But Nelson realized that if he could force a chaotic, close-quarters brawl, a pell-mell battle, that superior rate of fire would become a meat grinder. He didn't want a fencing match. He wanted a knife fight in a phone booth. But before Nelson could revolutionize naval tactics, he had to endure his own physical dismantling. His aggressive philosophy was forged in pain. In 1794, during the siege of Calvi in Corsica, a cannonball struck the ground near him, spraying sand and stone into his right eye. He didn't leave his post, merely bandaging the wound and carrying on. The sight in that eye was lost forever, but it was a minor injury compared to what awaited him at Santa Cruz de Tenerife in 1797. Tenerife was meant to be a daring amphibious raid to seize Spanish treasure ships. Instead, it became a bloodbath. As Nelson stepped off the boat into the surf, sword drawn, a musket ball shattered his right arm near the shoulder. He was hauled back into the boat, bleeding profusely. In a display of the shocking toughness that underpinned his frail frame, he refused to be helped up the side of his flagship, demanding a rope to climb up himself with his one remaining arm, apologizing to his officers for the mess. Below decks, in the dim light of the surgeon's cockpit, there was no anesthetic. The surgeon heated his knives and sawed through the bone. Nelson famously complained that the knife was cold, a sensory detail that haunted him. Within 30 minutes, he was back to issuing orders. But the psychological blow was severe. He returned to England believing his career was over. He wrote pitiful letters, referring to himself as a left-handed admiral who would never again be considered useful. He fell into a deep depression, convinced that his physical mutilation made him a burden to the service he loved. However, this period of darkness was the final tempering of the steel. When Nelson emerged from his convalescence, his vanity remained, but his fear was gone. He had survived the worst the enemy could do. He realized that life was short and fragile, and if he was to make a mark, he had to act with absolute decisiveness. He returned to the fleet not as a tyrant, but as a mentor. This is where he developed his most potent weapon, the band of brothers. Nelson realized that in the chaos he planned to unleash, the smoke, the noise, the broken lines, he would not be able to signal his captains. The visual flags used to command a fleet would be useless in the fog of war. So, he changed the command structure. He invited his captains to dinner night after night, sharing his bread and his wine, and more importantly, his mind. He talked them through every hypothetical scenario. He explained his intent so thoroughly that his captains learned to think like him. He decentralized command, giving them the autonomy to act on their own initiative as long as they pursued his primary goal, the total annihilation of the enemy. He replaced the rigidity of the Admiralty's instructions with a doctrine of trust. He told them that in the heat of battle, no captain could do very wrong if he placed his ship alongside that of the enemy. It was a revolutionary shift from centralized control to delegated execution. And in 1798, in the shallow waters of Egypt, he would finally have the chance to test this theory against the might of the French Republic. The summer of 1798 was defined by a high-stakes game of cat and mouse across the Mediterranean. Napoleon Bonaparte had slipped out of Toulon with a massive armada bound for a secret destination. Nelson, recently returned to command and eager to prove his worth, was sent to find him. For months, the British fleet scoured the sea, battling storms and missed intelligence. The pressure on Nelson was immense. If Napoleon landed his army and threatened British India, the strategic balance of the war would collapse. Nelson's frustration grew with every empty horizon. He wrote that the devil's children had the devil's luck. But on the 1st of August, that luck ran out. As the British ships rounded the coast of Egypt near Alexandria, the lookout on the HMS Zealous signalled the enemy in sight. There, in the curving sweep of Aboukir Bay, lay the French fleet. They were anchored in a strong defensive line, protected by shoals on the landward side and open water on the seaward side. The French Admiral Bruce believed his position was impregnable. He assumed no admiral would be foolish enough to attack a fortified line late in the day, with the sun already dipping toward the horizon. The treacherous shoals in the fading light made navigation a nightmare. Standard doctrine dictated that the British should observe, wait for morning, and then engage in a formal battle. Nelson did not wait. He saw the French fleet not as a threat to be managed, but as a mistake to be punished. He realized that Bruce had made a subtle, fatal error. The French ships were anchored by the bow only, meaning they would swing with the wind and tide. Nelson deduced that if there was enough room for a French ship to swing, there was enough room for a British ship to anchor. Where there was room to swing, there was room to kill. Without hesitation, and without a flurry of complex signals, Nelson ordered the attack. This was the moment the band of brothers proved its worth. Captain Thomas Foley of the HMS Goliath, leading the British line, saw the gap between the lead French ship and the shoal. He didn't need to ask permission. He knew Nelson's mind. Foley plunged into the gap, sailing inside the French line. The following British ships did the same. The French were horrified. They had prepared their guns on the seaward side, expecting a conventional attack. Their landward guns were often lashed down, obstructed by piles of supplies and furniture. Suddenly, British ships were anchoring on their blind side, raking them with devastating fire from mere yards away. Meanwhile, the rest of Nelson's fleet attacked from the seaward side. The French van was caught in a deadly crossfire, 2 British ships pounding every single French vessel. As night fell, the battle descended into an apocalyptic scene. It was the first major naval battle fought entirely in the dark. The only illumination came from the muzzle flashes of hundreds of cannons and the fires burning on the shattered hulks. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that shook the seabed. Nelson himself was struck in the forehead by a piece of jagged iron shot. A flap of skin fell over his good eye, blinding him completely in the blood and darkness. For a moment, he thought he was dying. He cried out that he was killed and asked to be taken below, where he waited in the surgeon's cockpit, refusing to be treated before the common sailors who were already there. Above him, the climax of the battle arrived. The massive French flagship, L'Orient, caught fire. The blaze reached the powder magazine, and the ship erupted in an explosion so massive that the sound was heard 20 miles away in Rosetta. The shockwave momentarily stopped the battle. For 10 minutes, awed by the destruction, not a single gun was fired. It was a silence of absolute terror. By the next morning, the result was clear. It was not a victory, it was an annihilation. Of the 13 French ships of the line, 11 were captured or destroyed. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt, cut off from France, their conquest doomed to a slow death in the desert. Nelson had not just won a battle, he had altered the course of the war. He was elevated to the peerage as Baron Nelson of the Nile, but the victory came at a cost. The head wound left him with a concussion that would plague him with headaches and irritability for years. It also marked the beginning of his descent into the strange, fevered celebrity that would consume his personal life. The hero of the Nile was now the most famous man in Europe, and he was about to meet the woman who would become his undoing. Victory at the Nile brought Nelson glory, but it also brought him to Naples, a city that would become the stage for the darkest chapter of his life. He arrived in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, not as a conqueror, but as a broken man. He was physically shattered by the head wound received at Aboukir Bay, suffering from blinding headaches and exhaustion. He wrote to his friends that he was killed and finished. What he needed was rest. What he found was Emma Hamilton. Emma was the wife of the British ambassador, Sir William Hamilton. She was a woman of extraordinary beauty, charisma, and theatricality, a former celebrity model who had reinvented herself as a diplomat's wife. When Nelson's flagship arrived in the Bay of Naples, she fainted into his arms, crying out, "Oh God, is it possible?" It was a performance, certainly, but it was exactly the kind of melodrama Nelson craved. He was starved for affection and validation, and Emma provided it in overdose quantities. Along with her elderly husband, they formed a strange, public menage a trio that scandalized British society. They called themselves Tria Juncta in Uno, 3 joined in 1. Under Emma's care, Nelson recovered his health, but his judgment began to rot. He became increasingly intoxicated, not just by her, but by the flattery of the Neapolitan royal court. Queen Maria Carolina, a sister of Marie Antoinette, saw Nelson as her personal avenging angel against the French revolutionaries who had beheaded her sister. She used Emma to manipulate Nelson, feeding his vanity to ensure the British fleet served Neapolitan interests rather than British strategy. The Admiralty in London began to receive reports that their star commander was acting less like a British officer and more like a Sicilian mercenary. This loss of professional distance culminated in the events of June 1799. The French had supported a Republican uprising in Naples, driving out the royal family. When the tide turned and the Royalists, supported by Nelson's fleet, retook the city, a group of Republican rebels held out in the forts. They negotiated a surrender with the Royalist commander on the ground, Cardinal Ruffo. The treaty guaranteed the rebels their lives and safe passage to France. It was a signed, legal document of war. When Nelson arrived in the harbour, he unilaterally annulled the treaty. In a display of cold, legalistic fury that shocked even his own officers, he declared that rebels and traitors had no rights. He blocked the transport ships that were meant to take the surrendered men to safety. He turned the British fleet into a prison guard force, handing the rebels over to the vengeful royalist mobs. The most damning incident involved Prince Caracciolo, the Admiral of the Neapolitan Republican Navy. Caracciolo had once been a brother-in-arms to Nelson, fighting alongside him in previous campaigns. When Caracciolo was captured, he was brought aboard Nelson's flagship, the Foudroyant, in chains. He was exhausted, unshaven, and pleading for a trial by British officers, trusting in their sense of fair play. Instead, Nelson ordered a hasty court-martial composed of Neapolitan royalist officers held on a British ship under his shadow. The trial lasted 2 hours. Caracciolo was sentenced to death. He asked for only one mercy, to be shot like a soldier rather than hanged like a criminal. Nelson denied the request. At 5 p.m. that same day, the Italian admiral was hanged from the yardarm of his own flagship, his body left dangling until sunset as a grim warning. Nelson famously watched the execution without emotion. It was an act of calculated brutality that stained his honor. Even the Admiralty was appalled. Lord Keith, his superior, dryly remarked that Nelson had become deluded by a woman and a court. The Neapolitan affair showed the dangerous flip side of the Nelson touch. The same reckless independence that allowed him to ignore orders and win battles also led him to ignore laws and commit atrocities. He believed himself to be an instrument of divine justice, above the petty regulations of diplomats and bureaucrats. Eventually, the embarrassment became too much for London. Nelson was recalled to England, travelling overland across Europe with the Hamiltons, a procession that was part victory lap, part travelling circus. He returned to London not just as a hero, but as a problem, a genius who could save the nation, but who seemed incapable of saving himself. By 1801, the war had shifted north. A new threat had emerged in the Baltic, the League of Armed Neutrality. Denmark, Sweden, Prussia and Russia had banded together to resist British naval blockades, threatening the supply of timber and hemp that the Royal Navy needed to survive. It was a dagger at the throat of British sea power. To counter it, the Admiralty assembled a massive fleet. But in a decision that baffled everyone, they did not give supreme command to Nelson. Instead, they gave it to Sir Hyde Parker, an aging, wealthy aristocrat, more interested in his new young wife than in fighting the Danes. Nelson was appointed as his second in command, a chained wolf forced to follow a sheep. The relationship between the two men was strained from the start. Parker was cautious, methodically planning a blockade. Nelson was electric with impatience, pacing the deck and drafting plans for an immediate assault. He famously argued that the boldest measures are the safest, a summary of his entire military philosophy. He understood that every hour they waited gave the Danes time to strengthen their defences. Eventually, Nelson's relentless pressure wore Parker down. He gave Nelson 12 ships of the line and permission to lead an assault on the Danish fleet anchored in Copenhagen harbour, while Parker remained safely offshore with the heavy reserve. The Battle of Copenhagen, fought on April 2nd, 1801, was a nightmare scenario. It was not a battle of manoeuvre like the Nile, it was a siege. The Danish fleet was anchored close to shore, supported by massive floating batteries and the guns of the Treckrona fortress. The water was shallow and treacherous, filled with shoals that had no markers. Navigation was as dangerous as the enemy fire. As Nelson led his squadron in, 3 of his ships immediately ran aground, taking them out of the fight before it even began. He was entering the battle with a quarter of his force neutralized. What followed was the most brutal, stationary slogging match of the Napoleonic Wars. There was no room for flanking, no room for the Nelson touch. It was simply 2 lines of ships hammering each other at close range. For hours, the sound was a continuous, rolling thunder. Splinters flew like shrapnel, and the decks became slippery with blood. Nelson later called it the most terrible of all my battles. The Danes fought with a stubborn, patriotic fury that surprised the British, refusing to strike their colours even when their ships were burning wrecks. Watching from miles away, Admiral Parker saw the smoke and the grounded British ships. He lost his nerve. Fearing that Nelson was being destroyed, he made a decision that could have ended Nelson's career. He ordered the signal flag number 39 to be hoisted. Discontinue the action. It was a direct order to retreat. On the quarterdeck of the HMS Elephant, Nelson was told of the signal. He was pacing nervously, the stump of his arm twitching, a sign of his high anxiety. When the signal lieutenant pointed out the flags, Nelson shrugged it off. He turned to his captain, Thomas Foley, and said, "You know, Foley, I have only one eye. I have a right to be blind sometimes." He then raised his telescope to his blind right eye, peered at the flagship, and declared, "I really do not see the signal." It is remembered as a moment of wit, but it was an act of cold, calculated treason. If he had retreated then, his ships would have been raked by the Danish batteries as they turned, likely leading to a massacre. He kept the signal, engaged the enemy more closely, flying, effectively overriding his superior's command. However, the battle was reaching a stalemate. The British were taking heavy damage, and the Danish batteries were still firing. Nelson realized he could not win by force alone. He needed a psychological stroke. He went to his cabin and wrote a letter to the Crown Prince of Denmark. In it, he urged the Danes to cease fire, claiming he wished to spare the brave Danes, who were effectively beaten. He threatened that if the fire continued, he would be forced to set the captured floating batteries on fire, with their crews still inside. It was a masterful bluff. Nelson did not have the ability to carry out the threat easily, and his own ships were near breaking point. He sealed the letter with wax, insisting on using a proper candle rather than a wafer to show he was calm and not in a hurry, and sent it ashore under a flag of truce. The ruse worked. The Danish crown prince, fearing for his city, agreed to a ceasefire. The firing stopped. Nelson had turned a tactical stalemate into a strategic victory through sheer nerve. The aftermath vindicated him completely. The League of Armed Neutrality collapsed. Parker was recalled to London in disgrace, and Nelson was finally promoted to Commander-in-Chief. He had proven that he could win not just by maneuvering ships, but by maneuvering the minds of his enemies. But there was one final act left to play. The Peace of Amiens provided a brief respite, but by 1803, war had returned. This time, the stakes were total. Napoleon was gathering a massive army at Boulogne, visible from the English coast. The invasion of Britain was imminent. The only thing standing between the Grand Army and London was the Channel, and the man who guarded it. For 2 years, the fate of the world hung on the endurance of rotting wood and canvas. From 1803 to 1805, Napoleon assembled the Army of England on the cliffs of Boulogne. He built thousands of flat-bottom barges, ready to ferry 160,000 soldiers across the English Channel. He only needed one thing: control of the sea for 6 hours. He boasted, "Let us be masters of the Channel for 6 hours, and we are masters of the world." Standing between him and this mastery was the Royal Navy, conducting the most grueling blockade in history. And at the center of that blockade, watching the French fleet in Toulon like a hawk, was Nelson. This period was the ultimate test of Nelson's character. It was not a time of glorious battle, but of crushing monotony. For 22 months, Nelson never stepped off the HMS Victory. He paced the quarterdeck day after day, scanning the horizon, his body wasting away from stress and seasickness. He wrote that his heart was broken by the anxiety. He was guarding against a breakout by the French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, a man who was terrified of Nelson, but pressured by Napoleon to act. Nelson's strategy was risky. He didn't blockade the port tightly. He kept his fleet over the horizon, hoping to lure the French out. He didn't want to bottle them up. He wanted to catch them in open water and annihilate them. In March 1805, the trap finally sprang, but not the way Nelson intended. During a storm, Villeneuve's fleet slipped out of Toulon. When the weather cleared, the harbour was empty. Nelson was horrified. He had lost the French fleet. What followed was a high-stakes transatlantic chase that spanned thousands of miles. Villeneuve fled to the West Indies, hoping to draw the British fleet away from Europe, then double back to secure the Channel for Napoleon. Nelson, guessing the French destination through sheer intuition, pursued them. He chased them across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and back again, missing them by mere days. It was a logistical miracle that his ships, battered by 2 years at sea, could make the voyage at all. But the psychological pressure on Villeneuve was too great. Knowing Nelson was hunting him, the French admiral lost his nerve. Instead of heading for the Channel to support the invasion, he ran for the safety of the Spanish port of Cadiz. Napoleon's invasion plan collapsed. He broke camp at Boulogne and marched his armies east to fight Austria and Russia instead. Britain was safe from invasion, but the French fleet remained intact. Nelson returned to England for a brief respite, his final days on solid ground. The public adoration was hysterical. Crowds followed him in the streets, trying to touch his coat. But he could not rest. He told his friends that he had to go back and finish the job. In September 1805, he boarded the HMS Victory for the last time. As he left Portsmouth, he waved his hat to the cheering crowds, a gesture of finality. He joined the British fleet off Cadiz, where 33 French and Spanish ships were holed up. He had 27 ships. The numbers were against him, but he had something better, a plan that would revolutionize warfare. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, the enemy fleet came out. Nelson retired to his cabin to write a prayer and a codicil to his will. He then emerged on deck to orchestrate his masterpiece. He gathered his captains and explained the Nelson touch. He would not form a line. He would not trade broadsides. He arranged his fleet into 2 parallel columns, like 2 arrows aimed at the heart of the enemy. They would sail perpendicular into the French line, cutting it into thirds. It was a maneuver of extreme risk. For the final mile of the approach, the British ships would be sailing head-on into the enemy's broadsides, unable to fire back. They would be sitting ducks for 20 minutes or more. But Nelson calculated that the poor gunnery of the French and Spanish would save him. He was betting his life and the lives of 18,000 men on the premise that he could take a punch to deliver a knockout blow. As the fleets closed in slow motion, the wind was incredibly light, the ships moving at a walking pace. Nelson ordered his signal lieutenant to hoist the most famous signal in naval history. He originally wanted to say, "Nelson confides that every man will do his duty," but the word confides was not in the signal book. He changed it to England. Flags fluttered up the halyards. England expects that every man will do his duty. Cheers erupted across the fleet, but on the Victory, the mood was somber. Nelson walked the deck with his old friend Captain Hardy. He was wearing his undress coat with all 4 stars of his orders of knighthood sewn onto the left breast, a blazing target for any sniper. When asked to cover them, he refused, saying, "In honour I gained them, and in honour I will die with them." The time for manoeuvring was over. The Victory was leading the line, sailing straight into the wall of wood and iron. The first 20 minutes of the Battle of Trafalgar were a test of nerve that few commanders in history could have endured. As the Victory slowly pierced the enemy crescent, she became the focal point for the guns of 7 different French and Spanish ships. For nearly a mile, she sailed in silence. Nelson had ordered his gunners to lie flat on the deck to avoid the incoming fire. They could feel the ship shudder as round shots smashed through the oak hull, sending deadly splinters, shards of wood as long as spears, spinning through the air. On the quarterdeck, the slaughter began before the Victory had fired a single shot. John Scott, Nelson's secretary, was speaking to Captain Hardy when a cannonball cut him in 2. Nelson asked simply, "Is that poor Scott?" and continued pacing. Minutes later, a double-headed shot tore through a line of Marines, killing 8 instantly. The deck was becoming a butcher's shop, slick with blood. Nelson ordered the sound to be scattered more thickly to give the men traction. Through it all, he refused to change course or speed up. He was aiming for a specific spot, the gap right behind the French flagship, the Bucentaure. At 12:35 p.m., the Victory finally reached the line. She surged past the stern of the Bucentaure, so close that the yard arms of the 2 ships tangled. In that moment, the British unleashed their stored violence. As the Victory passed, she fired a double-shotted broadside through the French ship's stern windows. The devastation was absolute. The shot travelled the full length of the Bucentaure's gun decks, smashing cannons and men alike. In 10 seconds, nearly 400 French sailors were killed or wounded, and 20 guns were dismounted. The flagship was effectively neutered in a single pass. But Nelson's plan was not just to break the line, it was to create a pell-mell battle where chaos reigned. The Victory slammed into the French ship Redoutable, their rigging locking together in a deadly embrace. The 2 ships drifted together, locked in a point-blank duel. This was the melee Nelson had wanted, a confused, choking cloud of sulphur smoke where tactical signals were useless and victory went to the side with the steadiest nerve. However, the Redoutable possessed a weapon the British had underestimated. Her captain, Jean-Jacques Lucas, had trained his crew not just in gunnery, but in musketry and boarding. He had filled the fighting tops, the platforms high up on the masts, with sharpshooters and grenades. They looked down onto the exposed deck of the Victory like hunters in a blind. The British, by contrast, did not use sharpshooters in the rigging, fearing the muzzle flashes would set the sails on fire. It was a doctrinal difference that would cost Nelson his life. At 1:15 p.m., amidst the roar of the guns, a sharp crack sounded from the mizzen-top of the Redoutable, just 50 feet away. A sniper had spotted the 4 large stars on the coat of the small, one-armed officer pacing the quarterdeck. The musket ball struck Nelson in the left shoulder. It smashed through his epaulette, punctured his lung, severed a major artery, and lodged in his spine. Nelson collapsed to his knees, his one hand touching the deck before he fell onto his side. Captain Hardy turned to see his Admiral down. "They have done for me at last, Hardy," Nelson said, his voice surprisingly calm. When Hardy expressed hope, Nelson cut him off. "My backbone is shot through." He was carried below to the orlop deck, a dark, stifling space painted red to hide the blood of surgery. The scene was Dantesque. The wounded and dying were piled on top of one another, screaming over the thunder of the guns above. Nelson was laid on a purser's cot. He knew he was dying. The lack of sensation in his lower body confirmed the spinal injury. He refused to let the surgeon examine him out of turn, insisting he attend to the common sailors first. As his life bled away, the battle raged above him. Every time the Victory's massive 68-pounder carronades fired, the shockwave shook the dust from the beams onto his face. He kept asking for news. He needed to know if the annihilation was complete. After an hour, Hardy returned to the cockpit, sweaty and blackened with gunpowder, to report that 14 enemy ships had struck their colours. "That is well," Nelson whispered, "but I bargained for 20. Even in death, his standard for victory was total. The final moments of Horatio Nelson were a strange mix of the professional and the deeply personal. He gave final orders to anchor the fleet to survive the coming storm, his seamanship sharp to the very end. Then his thoughts turned to his need for love. He whispered to his captain, "Kiss me, Hardy." The stoic captain knelt and kissed his cheek, then his forehead. Nelson's last words were a murmur, repeated until he fell unconscious. "Thank God I have done my duty." At 4:30 p.m., the guns fell silent. The Battle of Trafalgar was over. The French and Spanish fleet had been erased as a fighting force. But as the smoke cleared, the mood in the British fleet shifted from triumph to profound grief. The news travelled from ship to ship, not by signal flags, but by word of mouth, stunning the crews into silence. They had won the greatest naval victory in history, but they had lost the soul of the Navy. The sun set on October 21st over a scene of utter devastation. The sea was heaving, the sky turning a bruised purple as the storm Nelson had predicted began to roll in. The British fleet, battered and towing the shattered hulks of their prizes, struggled to survive the gale. In the days that followed, many of the captured French and Spanish ships sank or were scuttled, their hulls too broken to make port. But the strategic reality was carved in stone. The combined fleet was gone. Napoleon's dream of invading England was not just postponed, it was dead forever. The news of Trafalgar reached London on November 6th. It arrived in the pocket of Lieutenant Le Penotier, who had raced via schooner and postchaise to the Admiralty. When he burst into the boardroom, he did not cheer. He simply laid the dispatches on the table and said, "We have gained a great victory, but we have lost Lord Nelson." The reaction of the nation was unprecedented. There were no bonfires, no drunken celebrations in the streets. The victory illuminations were dim. The mood was one of national mourning. It was said that people met in the streets and shook hands in silence, unable to speak. The cost of safety had been the life of their protector. But what Nelson left behind was far more than a single victory. He left a legacy that would define the next century of global history. Trafalgar was the decisive naval battle of the era, the punctuation mark on the age of sail. It secured absolute British naval supremacy for over 100 years, an era known as the Pax Britannica. The Royal Navy became the unchecked police force of the world's oceans, securing the trade routes that would build the largest empire in human history. No other nation would seriously challenge British dominance at sea until the rise of the German High Seas Fleet in the 20th century. However, Nelson's most enduring legacy was not geopolitical, it was psychological. He changed the soul of the Royal Navy. He replaced the rigid, rule-bound caution of the 18th century with a spirit of calculated aggression and decentralized command. The Nelson touch became the gold standard. For generations, British officers were raised on the legend of the man who turned a blind eye to retreat and sailed straight at the enemy. He proved that systems and signals are secondary to morale and intuition. He showed that a commander who loves his men, who trusts them with his mind and his life, can achieve the impossible. Yet, as we look back at Horatio Nelson, we must be careful not to polish him into a perfect marble saint. He was deeply, beautifully flawed. He was a man who abandoned his wife, who sanctioned the murder of prisoners in Naples, who was vain, petulant, and often insufferable. He was a physical wreck who spent half his life in bed. But perhaps it is these flaws that make his genius so compelling. He was not a god descended from Olympus. He was a fragile human who, through sheer force of will, forced the world to bend to his desire. His body was preserved in a cask of brandy. Legend says the sailors drank from it, calling it Nelson's blood, though this is likely a myth, and returned to London for a state funeral that rivaled that of kings. He was buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, ensuring that he would rest in the heart of the city he saved. Today, he stands atop the great column in Trafalgar Square, 17 feet of stone, gazing forever down Whitehall towards the Admiralty and the sea beyond. In the end, the story of Nelson is the story of the ultimate gamble. He bet everything, his reputation, his fleet, his life, on the belief that attack is the only true defense. He taught the world that in the face of overwhelming odds, the safest place to be is not behind a defensive line, but alongside the enemy, guns blazing. He was the one-eyed, one-armed genius who broke the line, and in doing so, he broke the mold of what a commander could be. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.